Welcome to Ampersand, the podcast helping good people be heard and comms people be better.
Thanks for joining me today, Don. It's good to see your face.
Oh, great to be here, Caitlin. Thanks for having me.
Can you share a memory from your first computer or early days on the internet?
First computer, I remember Dad got a one of the early desktops, very clunky. And one of my first memories is playing at the time a state-of-the-art video game. You talk about dating yourself. Dr. J versus Larry Bird, 1-on-1 with blocky pixels, green on a dark background. Caitlin, that was virtual reality. I was Dr. J or occasionally Larry Bird. I dunked a basketball in the virtual sphere, whatever they call it these days. Yeah, so I remember playing that early video game. Yeah, I think I don't think they've released a 2024, 2025 version yet.
Oh, there was no follow-up? That's so sad.
That's right. I think the computer went out of date, so no follow-up.
I remember Nintendo games where you had to blow the game so that it actually worked before you put it in. Yeah, those were the days. My kids don't know our struggles.
Well, we can go back to Tinker Toys and Kerplunk and all of those as well too. So yeah, that was fun. That was hands-on fun.
Yeah, my kids would have no idea what any of those things are.
That's sad. That's just sad.
All right, so shifting gears a bit because it's the 10-year anniversary of the TRC this year, and we wanted to get communicators in to talk about some of these issues. And obviously, you've had a long history with the TRC, and then even before that with other such things, comms and Indigenous reconciliation. Have you seen communications change since the TRC? Has there been improvements? Are there places where we're falling short?
Well, the first thing is, as you know as well as anyone, the whole sphere of communications has changed. It kind of connects to that first question about, there's no internet back then. You had to find different ways to reach people, fax machines, if kids Google fax machines, if you want to find out more about that. But there was, especially when it comes to Indigenous people, where connectivity is still, unfortunately, and really it shouldn't be an issue, but there's been the whole change in the communication sphere in general with social media, with the internet. But I think in terms of communicating about Indigenous issues, about Indigenous people and with Indigenous people, I guess if we're looking at the good and the needs work categories, I think the good is definitely more awareness. And I'm talking about the Canadian context amongst Canadian people, I think, about some of the issues and all of this. Almost everything you say when you talk about Indigenous people and issues has to come with a big caveat of still lots more work to do. It's not like, oh, we're doing good on that and we can rest now and move on to the next thing. But definitely more awareness. You see that in public opinion polls. We're never near the top, but at least there's some awareness. But I think it's a little shallow too when things like there's economic issues like we see right now. People are rightly worried about their quality of life, about taking care of their families. Our issues tend to slip down, but there's more awareness. And I think if we look at the needs work category, the big thing is people really still aren't sure of the direction forward. And I think that's in some ways, in spite of the good work of things like the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, so many people still aren't aware of the 94 calls to action of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. They're not aware of the 231 calls to justice of the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls, or the 107 calls to economic prosperity of the National Indigenous Economic Strategy, which together with a lot of other good work is really pointing a way forward. And I think one of the dangers there is when people are aware of an issue, but they're not sure what to do, they tend to move on to something that they think, well, on this issue, I can make a donation or I can join a march or things like that. So I think there needs to be much more communication on the path forward, which to me, if you have to summarize it, is about really supporting Indigenous-led innovation because it works, it succeeds, and it's good for everybody. So that's, I think, where there needs to be more work and more effort.
It's a great answer. Thank you. Indigenous-led innovation, and I mean Indigenous-led, everything basically in terms of when it comes to finding the solutions. Journalism obviously has played a big role in the awareness for public. There was hundreds and hundreds of stories about the TRC throughout the maybe thousands. I would say thousands, actually. But sometimes it's part of the problem. But during the TRC, it was also part of the solution. From your point of view, what is the media's role in all of this, in reconciliation specifically?
Well, I recognize as a recovering journalist, and I say that with all love because I did enjoy my time as a journalist back in the day. First of all, we all need to respect that they want independence, that they want the ability to tell the stories that they see. So I think as someone now working in communications, we want to, help point them in what we feel are the right directions, recognizing that they're going to do the story, but really help provide the information, the background, the context that's going to be helpful in telling that story. I think, journalism is where most non-Indigenous Canadians get their news about Indigenous people. I would include social media in that as well, for better and for worse, because there's a lot of good information and a lot of misinformation out there as well.
Mostly for worse these days, I fear.
Well, the algorithms, we definitely need to be mindful of that, which really means all of us need to step up, whether you're a journalist or a communications professional, because you have to be a counterbalance, or ideally a counterweight to that, to get people pointed in the right direction. So I think journalism, there is a role to play, but I think there are some steps they could take. And in fact, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission final report does provide some actions towards media, specific more to CBC and APTN, but I think there's lessons that can be taken there for a lot of media. I mean, I think one really basic thing is get more Indigenous people across all levels of the system, from reporters to producers to technicians to HR. Just the more you get Indigenous people involved in these systems, the more you're going to get greater awareness and better information. I think as well, all journalism schools should include curriculum related to Indigenous people and history, because the context needs to be there. And there's been some work on decolonizing journalism. And in fact, I've heard stories of reporters who try to provide some context. And, I really want to be sensitive in this whole interview about some of the heavy subject matter we might be talking about. I don't want to sound cavalier about it. I think it's really unfortunate, but it's the truth that Canadian history, when it comes to Indigenous peoples, comes with a trigger warning. So I'm trying to be sensitive, but if you hear of someone going missing, journalists have tried to put some context into their story, or maybe a brief reason of like some systemic reasons why this happens. They'll sometimes get accused of, oh, now you're being an advocate. When in fact, if you don't get that context, you're really not getting the full story as to why this isn't a one-off, why this seems to keep happening. So I think that that is part of the story. That's not being an advocate. That's part of the facts. That's part of the history that people need to understand. So I think those are really important things for journalists and communications people to be mindful of. Duncan McHugh has a great book, and I don't own any shares in his publisher, but it's journalism. I think whether you're a journalist or a communications professional, and really almost anyone would benefit from reading that book. But in particular, in journalism schools, I think there's a real need to do that. I think the last thing I'll say in that question, Caitlin, because I'm reminded when I talk about Duncan McHugh, he has a program at Carleton now, and we're seeing more of these as well, which is actually reaching out to Indigenous youth in hard to reach or remote communities to give them some opportunities to learn journalism. And they may go on to practice it, they may not, but it gives them very practical skills. But it's a way, to reach those populations that aren't always easy to get to, and give them a voice. Because I really do think our voices, our stories, and our ways of telling stories will really benefit the profession. It's not about sort of a unique or special way of just looking at things. It really would benefit the way that stories are told and communicated.
Yeah, we were lucky. Duncan graciously made time for this podcast, so he will also be in this season talking specifically about that.
You got the connections, Caitlin?
Oh yeah. I just pick up the phone, Don.
Your Rolodex, which
yeah.
in our ongoing theme of young people Googling some of these terms.
Yeah. I think I would be lost without my phone, because I do not have a Rolodex anymore.
Me neither.
Speaking of like education and, the importance of sort of the context piece, it's interesting. I've never heard that people like journalists are getting accused of advocating when they're using facts, but that I shouldn't be surprised anymore. People are jerks. There's growing talk about bringing Indigenous knowledge and ways and beings into classrooms and lecture halls. From your perspective, what's working and, what's still missing?
Well, I'm not an expert in Indigenous education, but I've certainly, done a lot of work because education is so important. It really is, I think, one of the keys to unlocking the full potential of this youngest, fastest growing population in the country. I think what I've seen working is a few things. One is, first of all, getting Indigenous people, including Indigenous young people, like embedded into the institutions of learning, not just Indigenous institutions. I'm talking about any university, like into the governance, into the strategic direction, into finding better ways to support students, Indigenous as well as others. And where you see that happening, you're seeing new perspectives being brought forward, and you're seeing innovation and changes to the system that, again, are actually succeeding. It goes back to, if your mantra is people are jerks, I'm kidding, Kate. Mine is support Indigenous innovation because it works, and it works for everyone. It supports Indigenous students, but it also brings changes about that really provide supports for a lot of people. So I think really having a real say, not just a committee that you ask to report or do up a briefing note every 6 months or whatever, but having a real say in the governance of the institutions is important. I think the other thing is supporting education, much more support in Indigenous communities, which means a couple things. One is dealing with the funding disparity, where you have federal policies that say a library may or may not be in the school. There might be a computer, but it might be one computer that everyone shares. I don't know how in 2025, let alone in 2010, anyone could say, well, computer education really isn't that essential to anyone's education. So really dealing with those disparities, but as well, I think I would turn the question around as well and say part of it is getting education out of the lecture halls at universities and into Indigenous communities, which is there are innovative things going on right now. They're supporting the current system, but also community learning hubs in Indigenous communities that can provide quality university education in communities through internet connections. And you have these learning hubs, which are essentially, they have all the resources that a classroom would have, and students don't have to leave their home community to get that education. They don't have to deal with the practical things like, okay, I need a job so I can support myself. I need to find accommodation that I can afford. I need to figure out bus routes so I can get to my job and get to my classes. I need childcare in some cases. They have all the supports in their community. And more than that, they're surrounded by their languages, by their cultures, by their elders and knowledge keepers, by their ceremonies. They don't lose that when they go to the city as well. And they can come up with a quality university education strong in their identity. So there's really innovative things like that going on as well that I think really need to be looked at and supported.
That's really exciting. And yeah, I think part of the problem is always that, residential schools pulled people out of their communities and moved them to places far, far away. And that's caused all sorts of disconnect.
Absolutely. And that's another move that's happening now is more on the land learning, which a lot of people who aren't familiar with it might think, oh, that's good. They can learn about the environment or the soil and the plants. And there is that. But as well, you can use on the land learning for everything with sort of non-Indigenous teachers, but as well elders and knowledge keepers. You can learn about history. You can learn about science, all different kinds of science. You can learn maths and languages. That's your classroom right there. And that goes back to more the ways that we used to learn when people talk about Indigenous ways of knowing and being. So there's a lot of interesting things happening that I think can be scaled up and supported.
Yeah, 100%. You alluded to misinformation, and I like that the idea of you need to be a counterweight on social media. Given that misinformation is everywhere, and unfortunately rearing its ugly head in Indigenous rights and history online, what actually works when it comes to reaching the broader public with the truth?
Well, I know, Caitlin, you and I have talked about this before. One thing that really concerns and disturbs me is the growing and more organized move around residential schools denialism. There's always been, unfortunately, in Canada, going back decades, there's always been the people who are like, well, my dad got strapped and he's okay. He didn't need compensation. But we know, well, I like to think, well, we know, and hopefully more people know, it was so much more than that. It was so much more. But now you're seeing people organizing and really trying to change the reality of what happened in the schools. And a lot of it is, again, this is where Canadian history has a trigger warning. So I want to be sensitive, but a lot of them are using the unmarked graves to say, well, where's the proof, right? And it's a really disturbing, sad, to say nothing of angering response when someone may have lost a loved one and your first response is, well, I need to see a body. I mean, that's what it boils down to. And it's that terrible. And I think that's one of the things amongst a lot of the misinformation we see. I mean, first of all, that's how it can be received. And I think people need to be conscious of that. But the TRC itself said, if we want to step aside from that issue, talked about at least 6,000 deaths in the school. So the whole sense of using the unmarked graves issue as like sort of, well, nothing bad happened. I mean, the reality is it's there. It came out in the 2000s about the medical school, about the medical experiments that happened at the school. So I think that's a really important area that needs pushback because you see this in other, similarly tragic situations as people get older. As we sadly lose survivors and even people who just bore witness or worked at the schools, it gets easier to push this stuff. So I think it's really important that it be a mission for everyone to educate others and educate themselves. Now, the way I think this connects to your question is this is difficult subject matter to talk about. I think we need to find ways, for example, we talk about curriculum, there is good work underway to start introducing these subjects at an age. We don't want to traumatize young children, but the problem is, I've always said there's more, I believe, more ignorance in Canada than racism. And by that, I don't mean ignorance in the pejorative sense of, oh, people are dumb. It's just, I know when I grew up and I went to a school in Winnipeg, didn't learn anything about the first peoples of this land. Maybe a little bit that there were people here when the newcomers arrived, and then I don't know what happened, but now here we are in the situation we're in. So I think that we need to find creative and sensitive ways to introduce the history, to talk about the history. And I think if you're trying to push back on this, one thing I found, is you want discussions that resonate emotionally, but that emotional resonance has to be based on the truth and the facts, because when people are actually take the time to listen and learn, they often go, yeah, I can see how this wasn't right and how this really needs to be addressed, how this wasn't just. And I think part of the problem is, so many Canadians feel we're in such a wonderful country, the beacon of human rights, that in some cases it offends their sensibilities, which creates another barrier. I think young people are much more open to questioning received wisdom or reality, again, for better and for worse. But I mean, they are open to sort of learning the truth and then how we go forward based on our past. And I think as well, there's a lot of opportunities for journalism, to address these issues. I think as well, I would encourage people to as well look to the creative arts, which is another outlet where people can be reached, whether it is watching some of the amazing television series we have right now, going to plays, various movies, go to comedy shows. There's a huge Indigenous comedy community in Canada right now. You go to almost any city, they've got an Indigenous community. And what I love is whether it's comedy or theater, you're going to hear discussion of the Indigenous issues and history. You're also going to hear people talking about their family, their foibles, travel, food, going out with friends. You're going to realize, okay, there's not this massive gulf, this huge divide. We actually have a lot in common once we realize we learn about each other. And the last thing I'll say is, there's a lot to be angry about, and anger certainly has its place. But I've always found, as much as possible, if we can build bridges, that helps as well. I mean, that creates a common understanding. Whereas, we're all people. If someone just yells at me and berates me, I'll probably start to tune out, and I may just even, turn off and walk away. So, with respect to where we should be angry, ideally it's collectively angry. Let's try to like build a bridge of understanding based on our shared knowledge of the history and the way forward.
Sort of in that vein, like thinking about building bridges. I mean, I get asked regularly, so I imagine you get this question too. But like, as communicators, like, how can we help? What can I do? So do you have a thing you tell folks when you get asked for advice on how they can like lend their support to reconciliation?
Yes, I say attend my workshop, which is at a reasonable fee. No, I'm kidding.
I was like, really?
I don't do workshops, just in case anyone's wondering. That's although I would happily do it. I would happily do it. But that does get to one point, which I hadn't really intended with that. But one point is I do know some of my First Nations friends who are really, a lot of them will say, I'm done answering questions. I don't want to be, I'm tired of, do your own work, figure it out. And I always think as a communications person, okay, if you are being asked to do a workshop or you're being asked to give a talk or you're formally being asked to speak, yes, you should absolutely be recognized and compensated for the work involved. But if someone just asks me a question, that's a great opportunity. I mean, obviously they want to learn more. So I do think, we should always try to keep those channels of communication open. The other thing I would say is, and I think this is not any tremendous great insight, but, do some of those things, like read. If you can't read the whole Truth and Reconciliation Commission report, read the calls to action, read some of these other reports. There's a lot of good communications materials. And this is things that, communications professionals can be supported, is the creation of, concise materials that, recognizing not everyone's going to read like the Royal Commission was like a 6-volume report. Not everyone's going to read that. Well, there's a popular version, that's much more condensed. It's about 100 pages. The National Indigenous Economic Strategy has a 2-pager that covers its highlights. So I think there's very accessible things that people should be looking at to create their own understanding. We also, of course, need to be visiting Indigenous communities, attending events that are being put on by Indigenous organizations, learning more about it. So there's so much that we can be doing that doesn't require a tremendous effort, but all of it is about exposing yourself to the issues, to the current realities, and learning about the path forward for all of us.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, education is key to most things, I would argue. So did you bring your crystal ball? Because here's our last question. We do it for all guests. So we're 10 years out from the TRC. Where do you think we're going to be in 10 more?
By pure coincidence, I don't have my crystal ball, but I have my wife's Taylor Swift tarot cards right in front of me, which I didn't bring for the interview. So, and they're just for fun. I'm not advocating anyone's spirituality.
What does Taylor say?
Well, the card reading will cost extra, but I'm not equipped to do it. It's interesting. I was at the apology in 2008 for the residential schools delivered by Prime Minister Stephen Harper, attended by representatives of the National Indigenous organizations. I was literally on the Hill. They had big screens set up, and people, we can criticize it, we can embrace it. It's really up to every individual, in particular the survivors, to decide how they receive it. An apology is not mine to accept on anyone's behalf, but I was mindful of it. And I know a number of people thought it was a day that would never happen. And an apology compels action. So it certainly wasn't the end of what happened, which then, when I was at the Assembly of First Nations in 2020 is when the Indigenous Child Welfare Act was passed. And so here we had an apology for what was essentially, taking children, damaging the parents, damaging the children, seriously damaging the language and culture, on top of the other assaults that we saw and that were documented by the TRC, towards a move to really create approaches for Indigenous people to take care of their own children. A lot more work needs to be done. I always say that's the context for almost everything I say. It certainly didn't feel like a completion, because even then, the Child Welfare Act, there's much more work to do on child welfare. So when you ask where will we be in 10 years, it's of course hard to say. I am the most cynical optimist you'll ever meet. Cynical, but
I love it.
Ultimately. And where that optimism comes from, though, is from the Indigenous young people that I see, hear, work with, read about, their energy. It's truly inspiring, given the challenges, what they're doing to reclaim their languages, their cultures, their identity, with full support and with full outreach to their elders and knowledge keepers. That's much a growing movement as well, to assert themselves, to assert Indigenous-led approaches to education, to clean energy, to the environment, to employment and training, to child welfare, to everything. That's what gives me hope. And I think all Canadians should look to that and really support where they can, as we've been talking about Indigenous-led innovation, in particular from Indigenous young people who are doing amazing things across the country in spite of the challenges. I think that's what gives me hope, that we will be further along in the move towards reconciliation. Because the other thing that people need to be aware of, this is the youngest, fastest growing population in the country. This is the future of our country. This is the future for all of us, economically, politically, culturally. It benefits all of us to be supporting young people through education and on to the livelihood that they want to pursue. The National Indigenous Economic Strategy says if we bring Indigenous levels of education employment up to the Canadian average, we add $27.7 billion every year to Canada's GDP. So we should do things not just for the bottom line, but for people who may not be as engaged, or maybe, only thinking of their own quality of life. Well, the bottom line is that supporting Indigenous-led innovation is good for all of us. It's an investment in our future that brings back massive dividends. And again, it makes for a stronger country, not only economically, but culturally, politically, and really gives us all a country that we can say is doing the right thing, that is working towards reconciliation, that is a more fair and just country for all of us.
Well, that's it for this week's episode of Ampersand. Thanks for joining us. For more comms and design tips, sign up for our newsletter at m-agency.ca and follow us on your favorite podcasting app so that you don't miss our next episode. Ampersand is hosted by Meghana Ramaswamy and me, Caitlin Keeley, and it's produced by Elio Peterson. This podcast is a project of M-, the small agency focused on big impact helping progressives be heard.